So a couple of goals for today. First and foremost, the goal of all of these branching out sessions is networking and building connections with people from all across the state. So feel free to use the chat and talk to one another. That's definitely something that I want you all to get out of this. And then the second goal for today is establishing this line of communication between the Colorado Forest Health Council and Colorado's Forest Collaboratives. So I am serving on the Forest Health Council as the collaborative's representative. And I'm still kind of going to be experimenting with how is the best way to link collaboratives with the council. So if you look at the link that Nicole will put in the chat, that's the meeting summary that I wrote up for our February quarterly meeting. I plan to do written summaries for every meeting, and then we'll kind of see if this is a good avenue for the council to get feedback. Then we'll continue to do these verbal summaries as well. And if you have any other suggestions for how to strengthen that linkage, then please let me know. So this is our roadmap for the day. First, I'll give a quick overview of what the Forest Health Council is. I know some people know really deeply what it is, and other people have never even heard of it. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Then I'll give a summary of the quarterly meeting that happened a week ago today. And then we'll go into breakout rooms. And what I want from these breakout groups is just to hear directly, what do you all want the Forest Health Council to know? And more importantly, what do you want to see the Forest Health Council do? And then the follow-ups that you can expect from me after this meeting, I'll be sending out a written summary probably early next week of the meeting. And then that written summary will include a section summarizing the breakout groups from today. And then that summary of the breakout groups I'll share back with the Forest Health Council. I'll send it via email to the whole council. And then there's also a legislative committee meeting tomorrow that I'll share that with specifically. So first off, what is the Forest Health Council? This is a super quick overview. This is a 26-member governor-appointed group. We are a volunteer stakeholder body whose role is to provide a collaborative forum to advise the governor and the General Assembly on issues, opportunities, and threats to Colorado's forests. You may have seen the Forest Health Advisory Council, which was a previous kind of version of this group, but it's only existed in its current iteration for a little over a year. So Nicole's going to link to last year's annual report, which was our first annual report as the official Colorado Forest Health Council. So in December of last year, we were all sent out a survey to rank the priorities that we would like to see the council cover in 2023. So I'm going to go through those really quick so that you know kind of what's on our mind right off the bat. The first is landscape scale priorities. So this one has an asterisk by it, and it's got a little explanation underneath it because this is actually something that's mandated in the legislation that created the Forest Health Council. So this is landscape scale planning to identify state level priorities for forest restoration, wildfire risk reduction, and related management, and also key barriers inhibiting the achievement of those priorities and solutions to overcome the barriers. The next priority is forest management techniques to support water resources, maximizing success of infrastructure law implementation and coordination. The fourth one is another mandated one, monitoring trends related to forest ecosystem health, including those related to climate adaptation, advising on opportunities for state level action, specifically around post-fire restoration, regeneration, and replanting. 5 is proposals for clearer public communication channels to highlight progress and opportunities for public participation. And I believe this is specifically related to the Forest Health Council, because up until now, there really hasn't been a lot of outreach around the council or updating people outside of the council. And the 6th priority is woody biomass, so development and support of solutions to manage and utilize woody material produced by mitigation work, including consideration of climate change and ecological impacts. So you can kind of keep those in mind as the top 6 priorities that the council has identified that we're going to focus on in 2023. And here's a quick timeline of what you can expect from the council in the next couple of months. This summer is when we really are going to ramp up our activity. So from May to July, the committees are going to be working really hard behind the scenes to develop recommendations that'll go out to the legislature, agency leadership, and in our annual report. And then our next quarterly meeting is on July 27th, and we'll be voting on recommendations at the quarterly Forest Health Council meeting. So the committees will bring their recommendations and the Forest Health Council will vote on which ones they actually want to push forward. And then in August, that's when the council will brief the Wildfire Matters Review Committee. This is a committee of the Colorado General Assembly. So that's kind of our legislative link. And then we'll also complete our 2023 annual report, and that'll go out on all the Forest Collaboratives Network channels so that you all have access to that. So currently we are here, and I am seeking input on how the Forest Health Council can be most impactful to you as forest collaboratives. So throughout this presentation, just be thinking about where the things that I'm talking about might fit into your work and what you might recommend we add or change. So here's a couple of ways you can get involved with the council. We have a webpage. All of our meetings are open to the public. In particular, I would recommend people attend the quarterly meetings. They are 3 hours long, and the next one is July 27th. If you go to the Forest Health Council webpage, the meeting links will be posted there at least, I think, 24 hours in advance. And then you can always contact me directly as the Forest Collaboratives representative and share any suggestions you have or ideas. So now I'm going to get into the actual summary of the meeting. It was kind of in 3 parts, and the first part of the meeting was a tour of the Big Thompson watershed. So the goal of this tour was to enhance Forest Health Council members' understanding of situation happening on the ground, discuss successes and challenges that the partners in the Big Thompson have faced, and then highlight the strategic value of the newly formed Big Thompson Watershed Health Partnership. This was a jam-packed couple of hours, and I'm gonna just kind of go over the highlights that I think are most relevant to this group. So we started at a local fire station in Loveland, and then we ended at the McGrath Ranch, which is a privately owned ranch in Estes Park. So some of the key topics that we covered were workforce challenges, funding successes, community engagement, and community perspectives on forest management. We talked about biomass and slash management, and in this photo, that's Laura Quattrini from the Big Thompson Watershed Coalition, and she was showing off their new air curtain burner, which is this machine that incinerates biomass on the spot. So they were really excited to have gotten that recently through a grant. And then we talked about the fire district's role in mitigation work. This is a photo from McGrath Ranch. We talked about the Cameron Peak fire and the impacts that it had on the local communities and the forests and watersheds. We also talked about implementation and technical aspects of post-fire recovery efforts. Some of the Forest Health Council members are really familiar with that sort of practitioner-based knowledge, and some of them really had no idea. So I thought that was really informative. And it was cool that we got to see this project site in person. I've zoomed in here in the background. You can see some work that was actually being done. So this was active thinning was happening. So it was really cool to get to see that. So in the tour, the Big Thompson partners made a couple of explicit recommendations, and then they also highlighted some challenges that they're seeing on the ground. And this was really good for the Forest Health Council to hear the practitioners telling them. So I'll go through a couple of the things that I had written in my notes. One explicit recommendation was to extend the Wildfire Ready Watersheds program. It's currently, I believe, meant to end in 2024, and they were talking about how, like, by the time they get their proposals ready, it's almost going to be over. And so they were hoping that the Forest Health Council will try and push that program forward. And then they also talked a lot about removing barriers to prescribed fire. And the Ember Alliance has a really cool 2-pager that goes into more depth on these, but I've just written a brief highlight of them. So they recommended amending the Colorado Certified Burner Program. This is a program that trains private landowners to burn piles. And one of the ways they want to see it amended is including broadcast burning training, because right now it does just focus on piles. They want to see clarification of what liability certified burners face, defining a standard of negligence in Colorado, and then adopting a prescribed fire claims fund. So they talked about how in California, there's kind of this big pot of money that's set aside in case the rare occurrence when a prescribed fire escapes, then the people burning aren't like solely liable for millions of dollars. And then a couple of the challenges that they highlighted: biomass issues. So there are thousands of unburned piles in the Big Thompson and some of the other watersheds nearby. There are also workforce issues trying to get contractors. I'm sure most of you are aware of these challenges. They also talked about in Estes Park, there are a whole bunch of residents and a lot of small acreage parcels, and these typically aren't prioritized in funding sources, and also just the behind the scenes coordination is really difficult. And then public messaging when communities all have kind of their own community personality. And so they shared how sometimes one neighborhood will really resonate with a certain type of outreach, and then the next neighborhood resonates with something completely different. And how can we do that capacity wise? So this is a list of all the speakers that talked during this 3-hour tour. So a lot of hands went into this. And like I said, I just gave kind of the high level overview, but I want to thank all of these people and encourage you all to get in touch with them if you have specific questions. Next up is summarizing the actual meeting portion of the meeting. So here's a breakdown of the agenda. I highlighted this down to the 4 key things. The first thing we talked about was council priorities, which I already went over earlier. So we'll start with committee updates. So one of the committees on the Colorado Forest Health Council is the Legislative Committee. It's chaired by Jody Shattuck McNally, who is the Larimer County Commissioner, one of the Larimer County Commissioners. And so she talked about 2 different bills that the Forest Health Council recommended and really helped push through. The first is Senate Bill 5, Forestry and Wildfire Mitigation Workforce. This one had a lot of stuff included in it. So essentially, it's measures to expand the forestry workforce, develop educational materials for high school students, help fund internships in forestry and wildfire mitigation, sending money to the Wildfire Mitigation Capacity Development Fund, and then let's see, expanding and creating forestry programs in colleges, and directing the State Board for Community Colleges and Occupational Education to administer a program recruiting wildfire prevention and mitigation educators. And then House Bill 1060 is a little more straightforward. It appropriated over $5 million to updating the Colorado State Forest Service nursery. And the major update from this committee is that both of these were signed into law within the last week. So this was really exciting. These are the first 2 bills that the Forest Health Council has really had a hand in, and they both passed with very minimal changes made from what the Forest Health Council had recommended. The second committee is the Leveraging Resources Committee. It's chaired by Amy Moyer. So this committee, which I'm also a part of, we presented a concept of a forest resilience planning guide, and we lovingly call this the pre-fire playbook because it's meant to be a complement to the post-fire playbook, which I think Nicole is going to share in the chat if you have not seen that. The purpose, I'm going to read all of these because I think they summarize it pretty well. The purpose of this is to assist with positioning all areas and communities in Colorado to better leverage resources, knowledge share, and be competitive in receiving funding to achieve forest health management and resiliency. The guide is meant to serve as a resource for collaborative readiness and actions for stakeholders to take prior to a fire to be more prepared to live with fire. The goal of the pre-fire playbook is to provide a starting point on how to access modeling, resources, capacity, and statewide priorities in order to improve existing processes in pre-fire planning and forest health efforts. And it's targeted mostly at the local government and community level, but is also meant to be applicable to a broad range of stakeholders who are interested in advancing pre-fire planning and building forest health resiliency. So one of the main questions that we got on this playbook is, how does it interface with the wealth of existing resources out there in this kind of area? And the answer to that is that it's really meant to be a guide. So it's supposed to kind of move community leaders through the wealth of existing resources, help them understand which resources might be best utilized at what stage of readiness they're at, and then help agencies identify opportunities that they could give to the right communities at the right time. The next thing we discussed in the meeting was a legislative update. I decided not to go super in depth on this just because the Forest Health Council didn't actually have a hand in these bills. So this was just tracking legislation that was relevant to the Colorado Forest Health Council. So if you're interested in viewing that, I created a little Google Doc that tracks all of that. It is definitely interesting, but the Forest Health Council didn't actually push those bills through. And lastly, we listened to some agency updates from the State Forest Service, the Division of Fire Prevention and Control, and the Department of Natural Resources. The U.S. Forest Service typically would give an update during this time, but unfortunately our Forest Service rep was having some technical difficulties, so we didn't get a chance to hear from her. Mike Morgan is the director of the Division of Fire Prevention and Control, and here's just a couple of the highlights that he shared. One, he talked about how Southeast Colorado is at very high wildfire risk right now, which is strange because here in Fort Collins, we've been drenched in rain for the last week and a half. But in Southeast Colorado, they're facing dust bowl-like conditions, is how he described it. He also shared an update about a fuels module agreement, which is a DFPC team that is designated to burn piles on public and private lands. And then he talked about how currently there's really no statewide direction around prescribed fire. And so DFPC, the Forest Service, and the State Forest Service have all been kind of working to develop some statewide priorities and assessments around prescribed fire. Director Matt McCombs at the State Forest Service then shared his update. He had a lot of updates, and I've just picked out a few. So there's a lot of new funding coming into the State Forest Service, including the $5 million that I talked about through House Bill 1060. They have hired a new Associate Director for Policy and Legislative Affairs, trying to strengthen that link between the State Forest Service and the DNR and the legislature. And then he talked about how they're using some of the bipartisan infrastructure law money to hire 4 new staff that are going to be positioned around the state to engage with communities with limited resources in community wildfire protection planning. And lastly, he shared of a new Colorado-wide wildfire awareness campaign called Live Wildfire Ready. I've seen some people have already started sharing with this, but if you haven't seen it yet, there's a link in the chat to look at that. It seems like a really cool initiative to kind of make cohesive public messaging. And then lastly, Director Gibbs at the Department of Natural Resources shared some updates. He talked about the Colorado Strategic Wildfire Action Program, or COSWAP. Currently, they've got 34 workforce development projects going and 10 landscape resilience projects going. They are still in their first round of funding, but they're in the second season of implementation, I believe is what they said. And they've invested over $16 million in those projects so far. And then he shared about the Wildfire Ready Watersheds program within the Colorado Water Conservation Board. So they've completed the statewide susceptibility analysis. And there are templates available for wildfire ready action plans for local communities to create, and there's funding available to support those plans through their development and then project implementation. And I forgot to link to this, but I believe the website is just wildfirereadywatersheds.com. And lastly, he talked about the National Wildfire Commission, which he is a part of. And he was really pleased to share that they're having really similar conversations that the Forest Health Council is having at the state level. And so all of these big conversations are happening, and there's a lot of innovation going on. And finally, after the meeting, we went to Horse and Dragon Brewery here in Fort Collins for a quick presentation. Daniel Bowker with the Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed was there, and he gave kind of a brief overview of CPRW's history and how it relates to many other collaboratives in Colorado. So CPRW was formed after a massive wildfire and flooding year. And then they've just grown and continued on in their work ever since, I think 2012 is when they were formed. And he talked about their focus right now is really combining the technical components of forest health, wildfire mitigation, and stream restoration to try and get the right treatments happening at the right spot to make the most impact on the landscape. We also heard from the Horse and Dragon co-owner, Carol. She is the co-owner of Horse and Dragon and also a private landowner, and she's been working with CPRW to get work done on her land. And she shared a really inspiring talk about how, I mean, we're all connected to water, and all companies and businesses are connected to water, but breweries have a very obvious linkage to water. And so she talked about how breweries across Colorado, and especially Horse and Dragon, have been kind of using their platform to talk about water issues and really support the work that practitioners are doing across the state. So I'll wrap up with a couple of key takeaways. One is that the Forest Health Council truly and genuinely is just really interested and excited about the work happening on the ground, and especially happening by forest collaboratives. I can't tell you how many times in the Forest Health Council meeting, the word collaboratives come up, and they're looking to us and me as the representative to funnel up what I'm hearing from you guys, so that they can really make your lives and your work easier. There were some big wins in the legislative committee this week. It was really exciting that the first bills that the Forest Health Council really pushed were passed with very minimal changes. And then there's also support for collaboratives happening from the Leveraging Resources Committee. And so the Forest Health Council really wants to, again, make your lives easier. So the question for you that I have today is, what's next? I'll pause for a moment for Q&A, and then we can get into the breakout rooms. And I'll start sharing. I see a hand from Chaska.
This is great. I like this download format. Like, it's a lot of information, but it's nice to have a summary. It'll be extra nice for folks that follow the recording link on the website and like can watch it in a tidbit size, better than the 3-hour meeting.
Yeah, that's my goal.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. Well, I see that the slides from the presentation of the actual 3-hour meeting are up on the website. Are you going to put these slides up there too?
On the Forest Health Council website, or
no, on the CCC's website?
Yeah, I'll make a blog post on the Forest Collaboratives Network webpage, and it'll have these slides, it'll have my written version of the summary, and then yeah, any other information that I can manage to scrounge up, I'll put there as well. Molly?
You know, one of the things that I hear in most of the collaboratives I participate in, which is a lot, is just capacity, and how to fund capacity. And I think, you know, and I sit on the Furworm grant review panel, and, you know, we struggled with that a bit this year as well. So I think looking for a funding source would be helpful just on capacity.
Mhm.
Or even specialized capacity, like, hey, we need a facilitator because we're working on X, Y, and Z, you know, is there funding for a short-term collaborative or facilitator that would help with some of those tougher conversations?
Right. Yeah, I hear that all the time as well. And I know that's a huge topic of conversation. And I think it's just a matter of figuring out how to do that. Paul, do you have a follow-up to that or a different question?
A different question. Thanks for that summary. And I'm glad I didn't have to spend 3 hours in standing in the rain. But the post-fire playbook, was that something that is being developed? Was that because I didn't see a link to that. Is that that's to be determined?
The post-fire playbook
No.
already exists. The pre-fire playbook is a concept that is
Okay.
coming into existence. So the goal with that is that the Forest Health Council will write up a detailed outline, and then the recommendation to the Wildfire Matters Committee and agency leadership would be to then get agency support on really building it out.
Okay, I got that. And then my other question was, what's your idea, Katie, of what it means for the Forest Health Council to push legislation? How does that work from what you know?
So in our annual report last year, they gave some explicit recommendations, and then to the Wildfire Matters Committee, which is a subcommittee of the General Assembly, they directly recommend those things. And then I don't know exactly because I wasn't on the legislative committee, but I know that they were like in the legislature kind of talking through those things and making more recommendations throughout the legislative session as well.
And is that done by actual Forest Health Committee members or by the agency leadership that's part of the committee?
I believe the Forest Health Council members spoke to the legislature. So because we took a whole vote at our last meeting that basically said we are allowed to endorse this bill as it changes, because they had to keep coming back to the Colorado Forest Health Council and be like, hey, are we allowed to support this with the new changes? So I don't know exactly the behind the scenes of that. I'm joining the legislative committee meeting tomorrow, and I'm thinking I'll probably join that moving forward so I can give you a better understanding of the behind the scenes work later.
Okay, one more quick question. The WUI bill, which I think is going to be the most impactful of everything passed, where there's going to be a commission formed to develop standards for building in the wildfire urban interface and determining what the wildfire urban interface is. Did the Forest Health Council talk about that, and why wasn't that one of the bills that they ended up endorsing? Were you there for that?
So that one was talked about in the legislative update that Courtney Young gave during the meeting. So the Forest Health Council was tracking that one, but we weren't directly having our fingers in that one. And I'm not sure why. I don't know if it's just because someone else had it taken care of. But yeah, so we were tracking it, but we were not directly involved in that one.
It is a bit controversial, Chaska, but it passed and got signed already. And I'm wondering Molly, maybe you know, if you're a close follower of the Forest, I would be interested to know why there might have been opposition within the Forest Health Council to that one.
I don't know if there was necessarily opposition. I think it might have just been that wasn't one of the priorities that the council had worked on and recommended.
Okay, well, I'd like to just put out to the group, I think that implementing that bill is going to be key, and maybe that's something that maybe it's not as involved for the collaboratives. We can talk about it in the breakout.
Okay, cool. I would like to hear more thoughts on that. Does anyone else have any questions before we move into breakout groups?
Katie, I just wanted to bring to your attention in the chat that Paula concurred with the need for funding for capacity that was mentioned earlier. And then Chaska asked if they're still planning to use their readiness framework. She heard a lot of stages of readiness in this conversation.
Yes, the pre-fire playbook is using the stages of readiness as one of the kind of inspirations to guide communities through the planning process. So it's not exactly the same as the stages that you sent, Chaska, but we're using it definitely as inspiration for sure. And Chaska has been very involved in talking to the Leveraging Resources Committee and sharing her expertise on that. So thank you.